Let me invite you to open up your Bibles to Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22, and we'll begin looking there in just a moment. I want to turn our attention back this morning to Jesus once again. We've been looking in a number of lessons at different aspects of Jesus that impress us, that call us to greater clarity and greater, I hope, closeness to God, and just to be impressed by the life that he lived and the example that he set. It is the example above all examples. And so I want to turn our attention once again to the death of Jesus. We looked a few weeks ago at the suffering during that moment. But what I'd like to do this morning is look at the words of Jesus, the things that he said leading up to his death, the things that he said during his death while he was suffering. I suppose all of us at times take a moment to contemplate mortality, and most of us have probably had occasion to contemplate it more frequently over the last year than we have on other occasions, maybe a little closer to home. Some of us have had occasion to grieve mortality, if you will, because we have experienced it up close and personal, as it were. Jesus contemplated his own mortality, and as he did so, and as he came face to face with it, mortality that he chose to take on, in fact, it is striking to note the way that he meets that challenge. And I think we find for ourselves some great encouragement and a great example to follow after. Well, to begin with, as we consider Jesus' final words, I want to look at the words of agony, the words of grief, the words of pain and sorrow, suffering, both leading up to and on the cross itself. And so looking over at Luke chapter 22, before the cross, we see Jesus in the garden there praying. And you recall the scene there, and we looked at it in our previous lesson there, where it tells us that Jesus withdrew from them, that is, his inner circle that he had brought there into the garden with him. He withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and he knelt down and began to pray, saying, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." I believe somewhat firmly, I try to not take too firm a stand on it, but I believe pretty firmly that what Jesus is asking is to avoid what he's about to have to go through. At the same time, I believe that he understands that that's not possible, and certainly leaves the door wide open for understanding that still has to be gone through, but the desire is to avoid it. Some, in fact, a great many commentators, as they approach this, try to make that desire something other than that. They would make this a plea to merely lessen the time on the cross. That what Jesus is saying is, Father, let it pass more quickly as possible. And I appreciate what they're trying to do. And I think one of the things they're trying to do, I've had this conversation with a friend of mine several times who really struggles with this particular passage. What they're trying to do is reconcile the notion that Jesus knows exactly what he's about to go through, what he has to go through, and yet somehow is asking to avoid it. And they're thinking, God, he is God, and he knows. And so this would almost be like an emotional breakdown, and you can't have God having an emotional breakdown. And I feel like what they're doing, and I've told my friend this, I feel like what they're doing is they're forgetting that Jesus is a man. And that so much of what happens going up to and on the cross is what a man goes through. God doesn't die. That was one of my responses. He says, God doesn't behave this way. I said, God doesn't die. And so I know it's hard for him to still be God, but then die. But it's because he's also man, and he's fully man. And he's going through everything a man goes through at a moment such as this. I think I think the notion that Jesus would say, I do not want to go through this, is part of the point. It's one of the things that we can learn, is that it's appropriate and it's understandable for us to look grief in the face and say, I do not want to go through that. That's not a matter of wanting what's on the other side, whether or not we want that or even believe that that's real. It's, I don't want to go through what it takes to get there. That's reasonable. It's reasonable to have a healthy fear of death. Now, I think there's a terror of death that we've got to avoid, but I think God created us to be people who did not want to die. In the garden, the notion is that they would not die, that God created men to live and gave them the capacity to live, it seems, everlastingly, and that death is the catastrophic consequence of not following God. But life is the reward. And life is what we want. Life is what we are created to want. And I think Jesus in human body says, I don't want to go through that. And I think that we need to be careful as we try to balance the need for having faith and confidence with the recognition that does not preclude these sort of words. Just because you have faith and you have confidence doesn't mean that you also don't say, I am not looking forward to this, to the process of getting there. And so sometimes when people quake at the thought of death, they may not necessarily be quaking at what's on the other side of death, but just going through the painful process. I have had I don't know if it's a fortune or misfortune, of being at the beds of many, many people as they approach death. And I have seen just conceive of any possible reaction. I think I've probably seen it as people approach that moment. People who approach it having no idea what to expect. They do not have confidence, but they've rejected the only thing that would give them confidence. And that is a horror to be at that bedside. People who have the confidence, but are shaken as they recognize that they are about to approach the judgment seat of God, and they begin to contemplate very seriously how devoted they are and how serious they are about that faith. People who are so confident that they are able to speak of it with a smile on their face. And then a whole lot of in the middle. And especially in the middle, when I was sitting in the hospital room with my granddad last year, and he was pretty certain death was coming long before I was. And I think that he had talked that way from time to time, and I was trying to, be positive and turn the attention to other things. And he said, I think that this is it. I don't think I'm going to make it out of this. And I said, well, we'll see about that. And we want you to. And he said, I don't worry about what'll be on the other side of that. He said, I know where I'm going, and so I have confidence. And he was tearing up, and he said, but it's hard. Yeah, it's hard. And what we see with Christ is he's not just some stoic Superman who approaches grief and agony and goes, I know where I'm going. This is no big deal. He's a broken man who says, I don't want to deal with this. I don't want to think about this. I want this to pass from me. And so I want us to think in terms of that there are times where we need to have that permission to grieve. Understand, though, that there's a balance there. The permission to grieve and the permission to even desire to avoid pain is not the same as actually surrendering to that despair and that agony. One of the most encouraging things about the prayer here in Luke chapter 22 is what follows. He says this. He's got this prayer of agony. Remove this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. Now an angel from heaven appeared to him, strengthening him. Now notice that strengthening him didn't just remove the agony, but it says in verse 44, being in agony, he was praying very fervently. It continues. And his sweat became drops of blood falling down upon the ground. But verse 45, when he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples, and he found them sleeping from sorrow. And he said to them, why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not enter into temptation. I love that Jesus has room for grief. He allows himself to grieve, but it has boundaries. And there's a couple of boundaries here. One of the boundaries is that for all that Jesus is asking, he continually prays, not my will, but your will. This is not a prayer for me to avoid my responsibility. If I can do that and avoid the pain, that's what I want. But what I want even more than that is to do your will. And I think sometimes as we sort of meld together fulfilling God's responsibility and the pain that may go along with that, it's almost like we say we should want the pain. And I understand there's a sort of acceptance. I want whatever gets me closer to God. But there's no sense in which I will ever look at pain in and of itself and say, give that to me. I may say, I will take it if it gets me there. And I think that's Jesus' prayer. There's a balance of acceptance of God's will that overweighs any desire to avoid, such that Jesus would go through anything that is God's will, all the while not desiring the grief. Not only that, but after he had gone through this process and the grief got so extreme, he is able through that process then to get up and to go over, not only to get up, but to go over to his disciples and tell them that what they needed to hear, to go on into the garden, to calmly, so calmly receive the mob that comes to get him. And as we see, to, with great clarity of thought, go through the entire process of the cross. And so the grief has boundaries. And so we allow it, but we don't just totally surrender to it. And let me just say that is not an easy balance. Most of the time we choose one extreme or the other. We go around where we bottle up, we hold it all in until there's a total explosion, or we just give ourselves over to it and we tell people, you don't understand grief, and people just slip all the way down into the depths of depression until they are immobilized by their grief. And if you say anything and you try to give any encouragement or help to come out of that grief, then they turn on you like a wounded animal. I'm going to tell you, I have been struggling with the balance. Amy and I have been struggling every day with the balance. And our conversation right now is we wake up in the morning and we know we're going to cry today. We cried buckets lately. And we say the same thing to ourselves over and over again. To get up like Jesus got up and go on and do the next thing that you're supposed to do. Because that's all we can do. We lay it at his feet. I try to hold it in more than she does. And maybe I suffer for that. I am amazed at her that she's able to pour that out and pull it together, and pour it out and pull it together. And I think that we have to have both. And I think it's a great encouragement to see that Jesus found that balance in the greatest agony and grief in his life. But that does not mean that he does not still grieve. It's not like you get up and pull yourself together and say, there, that's done. I won't have to worry about that anymore. I don't have to think about that anymore. He continues to agonize through the whole process, and there continues to be that balance between agony and duty. In Matthew chapter 27, and verse 46. About the ninth hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Clear quotation of Psalm 22. The people, I sometimes say, maybe they're so misguided and so disconnected from God's word in the way they should be that they don't hear what Jesus is saying. They don't hear the quotation of the scripture. My God, why have you forsaken me? As you go and you read Psalm 22, it is clear that Psalm 22 is not a denial of the character of God, that God is always there and that he is ever present. It is a recognition of what it feels like when you are going through times that God allows us to go through. And it feels like he's not there. And it repeats over and over through the Psalms. God, where are you? God, why aren't you listening? Why don't you answer my prayers? And in fact, at the cross, Jesus is in that very moment. Let this cup pass from me. It did not. And so there he is. Here's his answer. No. And so where are you? Why have you forsaken me? Here's the thing. Jesus knew why he'd forsaken him. Inasmuch as he had. I think there is some truth. I don't think there's the reality of forsaking in the way that so many people take that to the extreme. But there is the reality in that God has allowed Jesus to go through this. He is not saving him from this. And Jesus knows why. My dad and I were talking about this passage this past week, and he made a connection with John 3:16. God so loved the world that he gave. You might just say he forsook his son. He gave him up. And Jesus knows why. And even though he knows exactly what's going on, and even know exactly why he's forsaken, he still feels it, feels the weight of it, and there's still the cry. How much more us who don't know why? How much more will we feel that and maybe cry that out because we don't know? And so maybe you need to ask that of God. I think sometimes we're scared to ask questions like that of God. The psalmists were not. Jesus himself was not afraid to ask that kind of question. One of the things, of course, you find in the Psalms, very much like Jesus, Psalm 22, the psalmist sort of talks himself through that. And he recognizes the answer to the question, where is God? The same place he has always been. God hasn't moved. He is still there. He is unchanged. His plans are unchanged. And my going through this grief doesn't mean that he's lost somehow. Though it may feel like it from time to time. So, even yesterday, as I'm preparing this lesson, preparing my thoughts, getting them in order, and thinking about precisely how I'm going to say some things, I'm reading some of the quotes that we'll look at in just a few moments later in the lesson. And I cried for 10 solid minutes in my office. And I had my prayer just this. Where are you? And I look here and I'm so thankful. I'm so thankful that when Jesus says those words, they're not empty and they're not by themselves, but they direct my mind back to the answer. I know where you are. It's where you always are. And so I don't think that Jesus is just asking that question out of the blue, but I think he's asking it in the same way that the psalmist is. He's asking it towards a God who he knows where he is, but the feeling is expressed nonetheless. Ultimately, what I think that we need to wrap our heads around is that Jesus expresses approaching death and in death basic human needs. In John 19 and verse 28, John 19, verse 28 says, after this, Jesus, knowing that all things had already been accomplished to fulfill Scripture, said, I am thirsty. Now, I don't think that that's Jesus on the cross, like ticking off check marks and going, all right, what else am I supposed to say? Oh, I'm supposed to be thirsty. No, I think there's a sense in which when the gospel writers say in order to fulfill Scripture, that's in a grand scheme of things. That's not Jesus like processing through and making sure he checks all the boxes. Jesus is actually thirsty. And as you look at the whole picture here, there's an illustration in this very simple. There's not a lot of theological depth to that phrase, I thirst. But there is the depth of thought of recognizing that here is God. And what does he need? I'm thirsty. What a humbling thought that God would be stooped to the level that he has to make the pitiable cry. This is the same God. This is God who throughout the Old Testament says, who are you? You can't bring me anything. You can't give me anything I need. But he says, I just need a drink. And so, I think there's a lesson. Again, this is something that Amy and I have talked about, the lessons we're learning. There's a lesson to be learned about what Paul says about when I am weak, then I am strong. We have never felt so weak in our whole life, so impotent to be able to accomplish what we want to accomplish, to just have done with the things we want to have done with. And it's not spiritual weakness. That's another conversation. People would take Paul's words in 2 Corinthians and basically say, when I'm steeped in sin and weakness, spiritual weakness, then I'm really strong. That's certainly not Jesus. It's the recognition that here is how far this mortal frame can take me. And it's pretty pitiful. I am emotionally weak. I am physically weak. And I simply am unable to do what ought to be done. And so I surrender. And so here, the weakness of Jesus is on display. And in the midst of this display of weakness, what is he doing but conquering death itself? There's a real illustration there, I think. Well, as I say, this all has boundaries. And Jesus does not spiral into self-pity, but rather constantly pulls his thoughts away from pity of himself and turns it towards others and focuses on the needs of others. And so we see that all the way up to the cross. He is concerned that others are prepared. We already read in Luke chapter 22 that Jesus, when he gets up from this agonizing prayer, he walks over to his disciples and he says, guys, it's coming. You need to be prepared. It's almost here. And so for all this, he's still worried about them and about what's going to happen to them and about making sure that they are prepared for that moment. Over in Luke chapter 23 then, as he takes on the cross, aided by this fellow Simon who happened to be standing by. It tells us in verse 27, following him was a large crowd of people and of women who were mourning and lamenting. But Jesus, turning to them, said, daughters of Jerusalem, stop weeping for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. And then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For they do these things when the tree is green. If they do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry? So here are people, and they're looking at Jesus, and they feel for him, and they pity him. And Jesus turns around and says, I do not need your pity. You need to turn that here. Because what's about to happen to Jesus, though horrific, will not result in ultimate destruction. It'll result in ultimate victory. He says, something's coming your way that there is no hope in. And so all your concern for me, I've seen this as I have talked with people about their impending death. And I've sat at bedsides talking about funeral sermons. What do you want to include? Those very strange and sobering conversations. And more than once, I have sat at a bedside and had someone tell me, do not get up and talk about me. Don't talk about, the sorrow leading up to my death. There are going to be people there who need to hear the gospel. And I want you to focus on them. And I think that's very much the example that Jesus leaves here. You got the wrong idea. If that sorrow doesn't make you look inward and take stock and think about what's coming for you. And those are words not of judgment. Those are words of mercy and kindness. He was concerned for the care of those that he was responsible for. John chapter 19, again, that was read in our reading this morning. Here he sees his mother and some other women standing near the cross. And he sees John there. And he says, behold your mother. And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own household. It is a great kindness and clarity to look around and think what's going to happen to these other people. How are they going to be taken care of? We take measures and we make out our wills and so forth. And I think that there's an appropriateness to that. And here Jesus, in the midst of all this agony, is still saying, someone needs to take care of her. And let me make sure that to be able to take your mind off of that and say, hey, let me take care of this. It's such a strong outward look, a strong desire to make sure other people are cared for. Well, of course, we come to the forgiveness. There is in the first case the forgiveness of the contrite man, the thief who had mocked. But now in chapter 23 and verse 39 has changed his tune. One of the criminals who were hanged there was hurling abuse at him, saying, are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us. But the other answered, and rebuking him said, do you not even fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed are suffering justly, for we are receiving what we deserve for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong. And he was saying, Jesus, remember me when you come in your kingdom. And he said to him, truly I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise. There is tremendous mercy there. There is, just as the thief said, no responsibility on Jesus' part to extend mercy. As he says, he is suffering justly. He has no right to demand anything from Jesus, and yet, without hesitation, it seems, Jesus says, granted. You got it. Now, when we see that, it may be easy for us to reconcile with that because at least this man changed his tune. But what about the rest? Back in chapter 23 and verse 34, he said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And that is the most humbling phrase on the cross, I think. That here, the people hurling abuses, the people who are doing everything they can to increase his pain physically and emotionally, and Jesus says, I hope these people don't suffer for this. How many times have you felt as people have abused you that I hope they get what's coming to them? I know I have. I know I still do. And it is the cross that brings me back from that to recognize I do not, or at least I should not hope for that. I hope that they bring their sins to Jesus. I hope the same thing for them that Jesus hopes for them. And if I don't, then I don't have much hope for getting that myself. And so we have the overwhelming mercy of Jesus as he approaches death. The contemplation of mortality ought to make us think more kindly of those who are around about us, even those who would increase our sorrow and our pain and our grief. Well, fittingly, I want to conclude with Jesus' words of confidence. He says in John chapter 19 and verse 30, it is finished. It is accomplished. And I think back in Psalm 22, that may be an echo of the final words of Psalm 22. Just as he quotes the first words, my God, why have you forsaken me? In the final words, it is, he has accomplished it or finished it. And indeed, it is finished. That work, everything that he was hoping to avoid in the garden, that he prayed not to have to go through, now he's on the other side of it, at the end of it, and he can speak with confidence. I've done what I ought, what I came to do. Along with that, in Luke chapter 23 and verse 46, Luke 23 and verse 46, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And having said this, he breathed his last. And that is such a beautiful thought. The notion of just being able to say, I'm coming home to you. And Stephen, reflecting those words in Acts chapter 7, as he is being stoned to death and he is suffering in the very mode, the very path of the one that he follows, and he does the same thing. He looks up and he sees now Jesus, and he too commits his spirit into the hands of the ones that he knows holds all of it in his hands. What a great confidence to be able to speak with. You see, the end result, knowing that that's where he was headed in the end, was never the issue. When he prayed, let this cup pass from me, it's not a matter of, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know how this is going to turn out. In fact, I think his prayer is, I know exactly what's about to happen. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 2 says that the whole process is able to be endured because of the joy that's set before him. He knows. He knows where he's going. That's not the problem. The problem is the journey getting there, which can be very painful. I think that we need to spend more time visualizing the reward, such that we can speak with such confidence. We have the words of the Apostle Paul in 2 Timothy chapter 4 chapter 4. That are such a boon and encouragement, and we read them at the funerals of the faithful. He says so boldly, I'm already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. And in the future there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing. Can I say that the first words that we talked about, the words of agony, are not a contradiction to these words per se. In other words, you can know all of this and still have the agony. It is, though, having this that keeps that agony from turning into total despair. These kinds of words are what get us back up every single day and fight back the wave that could wash over us if we are not careful. I think about the words of famous people as they died. I'm finishing up a biography of Winston Churchill's wife, in which Winston Churchill ends up being more interesting to me. She's interesting in her own right. But for all that he accomplished, and it was a great deal, one of his overwhelming frustrations was that people constantly ignored his predictions until they came true, and they did come true in droves. And at his deathbed, they were still ignoring what he was saying about what was happening on the world stage. And reportedly, his last words were, "There is no hope." One of the greatest men of his time, lauded with accolades and really given the lion's share of the credit for defeating Nazism. And yet he dies a hopeless man. Queen Elizabeth I, her reported words at her deathbed were, "All of my possessions for a moment of time." And you could just go on down the list over and over of wealthy, intelligent, world-renowned people who are made a pitiable mess as they come face to face with the end of it all. Some of them having less than no hope, but rather knowing that they stand face to face with condemnation. There are a number of people that give me encouragement along these lines. There's a little speech in a book by C.S. Lewis by a little mouse who is one of the most courageous characters that he inserts into his books about Narnia. His speech is this. He says, "My own plans are made. While I can, I sail east on the Dawn Treader. And when she fails me, I paddle east in my coracle. When she sinks, I shall swim east with my four paws. And when I can swim no longer, if I have not reached Aslan's country or shot over the edge of the world in some vast cataract, I shall sink with my nose to the sunrise." I don't know how many times I've brought that speech up with my girls when they say something like, "What are we going to do?" We're going to keep paddling that direction. That's what we're going to do. Because we can have confidence then if we're always moving that direction. I don't know what we're going to do about all this, but we are moving this direction. I want to be able to say, not just with Paul, but with other loved ones, things like what my uncle said as he was joking with his brothers on his deathbed. And they seriously asked him, "Eddie, how are you?" He said, "I'm ecstatic. I'm going to heaven." Wasn't ecstatic about leaving his family. Wasn't ecstatic about suffering the ravages of cancer. But those words, I don't know Paul personally. I know Eddie personally. And what an encouragement that is. And I repeat those things. Bob Waldron standing up in the first sermon I heard him preach after Sandra's passing. And he says, "She has gone on the most wonderful adventure you can imagine. And I can't wait to follow her." I want to talk like that. And so, when my journey is something that I am praying God would help me to avoid, work around, don't make me walk through that. And then I have to walk through it still. These are the words I'm going to say. I know where I'm headed. I don't know how I'm going to get there, and I don't know how hard that's going to be, but I know where I'm going. And when I look at the cross, and when I look at Jesus coming up to and hanging on that cross, well, it helps me. And I hope it helps you to get up every day in front of whatever burdens you are bearing and know what's at the end of it and speak with confidence about what's at the end of it. But if you're here this morning and you fear death, well, that's natural. As I said, God didn't create us to desire death, but to desire life. There's one very ironic quote from one particular man of wealth. And he talked about what he would give No, I know. It was in an interview. And he had all this, just one of the wealthiest men in the world. And John Collins was interviewing him and said, if you could have one thing, what would it be? And he said, life everlasting. What an ironic interview. He could. But he couldn't buy it. And he was used to buying things. Do you want to be able to respond to those fears with the calming confidence of knowing where you are going? Do you want to be able to drop your burdens of bitterness and instead extend mercy without the weight of worrying about the justice of it all and what's going to happen to those people? So just lay that at God's feet. Then come to the cross. Watch him go through the cross and watch him open a door so that you know how to follow right after him. And if you would take that invitation this morning, if we can help you in any way, won't you come while we stand and while we sing?